and gentlemen. My name is Nick Larigakis, president of the American Hellenic Institute. On behalf of AHI, our nonprofit independent Greek-American public policy center, it is my pleasure to present today our noon forum to commemorate the 85th anniversary of Orchi Day and its meaning today, with our distinguished guest presenter, who is well known in academia, especially in the field of political science. Dr. Mylonas is an associate professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University here in Washington, D.C., and is a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He specializes in nationalism, nation building, diaspora policies, European integration, and qualitative research methods. Today is a day we pay tribute to the legacy Orchi Day left on the outcome of World War II. In 1940, with Europe under the heel of Nazi Germany, and with Britain fighting the Axis powers alone, Greece's reply on October 28, 1940 of Orchi to Mussolini's surrender ultimatum gave hope to the forces of freedom. While for many this may have been a lost cause, we are reminded of what Prime Minister Metaxas said at the time, and I quote, "Greece is not fighting for victory. She is fighting for glory and for honor. She has a debt to herself to remain worthy of her history. There are times in which a nation, if it wishes to remain great, gains by being able to fight, even if it has no hope for victory. But nonetheless, Greece, vastly outnumbered, ultimately did defeat the Italian army and push them into the mountains of Albania. This defeat of Mussolini resulted in the first defeat of the Axis in World War II. Although Greece eventually would succumb to the Nazi war machine, it did not occur without a valiant effort that included a brave stand at the Battle of Crete, which caused Hitler to delay his invasion of the Soviet Union, arguably changing the outcome of the war. Even today, we still see Greece's own resiliency come to the forefront as it endures constant threats from malign actors and forces in its region, especially those posed by Turkey. And the resiliency Greece displayed during World War II is seen today in other parts of the world, including like places in Ukraine. Certainly a comparison can be drawn between Greece's defiance of fascism to Ukraine's brave stand to stave off Russia's invading forces under the direction of a notorious dictator in President Putin. And other examples in Slovakia and in Georgia against Russian influences, as well as pushback against authoritarianism in Iran and Hungary, evoke the Orchi Day spirit. Indeed, the legacy of Orchi Day remains. The unequivocal and unwavering message of defiance conveyed on that day 85 years ago is needed now, arguably more than ever since 1940. To help us take a deeper dive into Orchi Day's modern-day significance as we commemorate this special day in Greek history, I am pleased to present our distinguished speaker, Dr. Mylonas. Professor, it's good to have you with us, and I give you the Zoom floor. Not coming across.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Lost you again.
Now, can you hear me? Sorry. Thank you for inviting me, Nick. I'm gonna speak for about 15-20 minutes and then we can have a discussion, right?
Yes. And I remind our audience to use the chat if they want to submit a question.
Fellow Greeks, friends of Greece, it is an honor to speak to you today to commemorate that pivotal moment of defiance on October 28, 1940, when Greece stood firm against fascism and totalitarianism. On that day, Metaxas's refusal echoed across the world. That moment was not only a denial to the Italian ultimatum, but also an affirmation of national unity. On October 28, 1940, in the morning, radios repeated the following message across Greece. Italian forces have launched attacks to our fortresses on the Greek-Albanian border since 5:30 a.m. Our armed forces are defending the fatherland. Metaxas's move transcended his regime uniting a deeply divided society in a collective stand against foreign aggression. Greeks of opposing ideological persuasions, rich and poor, refugees and natives, Christians and Jews, all Greeks rose up against the foreign invader. A few days later, the 5th Infantry Brigade, consisting of officers and soldiers from all over the island of Crete, was sent to the Albanian border to fight against the Italians. One of those in the 44th Heraclian Infantry Regiment was my grandfather. Soon enough, national heroes emerged, such as Konstantinos Davakis, the commander of the Pindus detachment, who successfully organized the defense of Greece's mountainous northern front, and Colonel Mordechai Frizis, a Romani Jew and the first high-ranking Greek officer who died heroically on December 5, 1940, while rallying his troops on his horse in the Pindus offensive on the Albanian front. But what was the broader context within which the Italian invasion occurred? According to most historians, World War II formally began on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler's Germany invaded Poland. At the same instance, France and the United Kingdom declared war against Germany. The patriotic duty of nations was clearly articulated at the time by their leaders. As Winston Churchill put it in the case of the United Kingdom, if this long island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground, he said. In terms of the role of small or smaller states in the war, Professor Mavrocordatos has argued that one might speak of an existential wager, the belief that in the long run, a nation had a better chance of eventual rebirth and survival if it went down fighting. This existential wager was made first by the Finns, then by the Poles, then by the Norwegians, or at least most of them, and eventually by the Greeks on October 28, 1940 and onwards. Ultimately, two rival military alliances were formed, as we all know. On the one hand, the tripartite pact united Japan, Italy, and Germany as the Axis powers. And by the beginning of 1942, the Allied Big Four, including the United Kingdom, the United States of America, of course, the Soviet Union, and China, and I remind you, France had already capitulated in June 1940, involving more than 30 countries. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, with estimates ranging from 70 to 85 million fatalities, most of whom were civilians. Beyond the myriad battle-related deaths, millions of civilians died in massacres, in the Holocaust, in strategic bombing campaigns, as well as by the sole use of nuclear weapons in wartime. By the summer of 1945, the Second War had concluded with the Allies' sweeping triumph. Once more, as after the First World War, Greece found itself aligned with the victors, on the right side of history, as we often say. Despite being a small state, Greece managed to get included in the pages written by the victorious great powers of World War II, the United Kingdom and the United States of America in particular. In military history, as Nick already suggested, Greece is most often remembered for its defeat of the Italians in the Greco-Italian War of 1940, and of course, for the renowned Battle of Crete, which took place in late May of 1941, where I have many uncles who fought in. Germany had invaded Greece in April 1941, and by May 20th, most of the country had fallen except for Crete. The Germans faced far greater resistance there than they had anticipated. After 2 weeks of fierce fighting, the Battle of Crete came to an end on June 1st, 1941. Greece was now occupied and divided between Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria. According to estimates, Greece suffered more than 400,000 casualties during the occupation, and the country's Jewish population was almost completely exterminated in the Holocaust. Mainland Greece was liberated in October 1944, but a fratricidal civil war had already begun, and it would not end until the late 1940s. Now, let's return to the events leading up to the 28th of October 1940, the day we're commemorating. In the summer of 1940, the Italians, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, had besieged Malta, conquered Somaliland, and by early fall, they were making inroads into Egypt. All of these places were under the British. At that point in time, the Italian army was ready to invade Greece from the Albanian border to counter British operations in the country. This was the context within which the Italian ultimatum arrived in Athens. Ioannis Metaxas, who was ruling the country through a personal dictatorship since 1936, had tried to keep Greece neutral up to that point. Metaxas's regime, though ideologically aligned with the Italian regime, astutely preserved cordial Anglo-Greek relations. Aware, on the one hand, of Britain's strategic interest in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also due to the emotional ties of King George II to the United Kingdom, where he spent a big part of his exile. When the Italian ambassador communicated the perfunctory Italian ultimatum in the early hours of October 28th, Metaxas, without consulting anyone else, replied in French, "It is war then." During the following days, the press and the public used a single word to summarize his response: "Όχι," no. The Italian attack was repulsed within days with heavy Italian casualties. By mid-January 1941, Greek forces had occupied a quarter of Albania. The stunning reversal not only humiliated Mussolini, but also captured the admiration of the world. But how did Metaxas get to this answer of his we're commemorating today? Already in the autumn of 1936, 4 years earlier, Metaxas confidentially told the Navy leadership, and I quote, "What I tell you, you will not announce to anyone. I foresee war between the English and the German bloc, a war much worse than the previous one. In this war, I will do what I can so that Greece does not get involved. But this, unfortunately, will be impossible. And I repeat again, this above all, not to leave this room, it is unnecessary to tell you that our position in this conflict will be by the side of England." Fast forward to October 30, 1940, Metaxas revealed his full rationale to the assembled newspaper editors. He began by emphasizing the need for their heartfelt commitment, stating, "Having a censorship, I can have you write what I wish. However, at this moment, I need not only your pens, I need your souls. I have therefore invited you here to explain myself to you. I will tell you everything, even my innermost political secrets. I want you to know all about our national adventure, so you may write not according to my instructions, but inspired by your personal belief and knowledge of things." Metaxas stressed that the decision was deliberate and well considered. "Do not ever think the decision to say no to the Italian ultimatum," he told them, "was taken on the spur of the moment. Do not ever imagine we entered the war unexpectedly or we did not spare every possible effort to avoid it." He recounted efforts to maintain neutrality, including warnings to Italy and restraint after provocations like the torpedoing of warship Ellie on August 15, 1940 in Tinos, which he knew was done by the Italians, but he kept secret. He also explained that while he sought to preserve Greek neutrality and keep the country out of the war, the Germans had made it clear to him that Greece would have to be amputated to the benefit of Bulgaria and Italy for that to be achieved. In particular, Metaxas put it in the following way, and I quote, "In order to avoid war, we had to willingly become slaves and to pay the price by giving Greece's right and left arms to be amputated respectively by Bulgaria and Italy. In such a case, it is not difficult to predict that the British, masters of the seas, following the enslavement of Greece by their enemies, would not fail to defend themselves by rightly cutting off Greece's legs, occupying at least the island of Crete, as well as some other islands." He then went on to explain that such a development would inevitably divide the Greeks and lead to a repetition of a national schism like the one he had lived through during World War I and onwards. This would be an unrepairable wound for the Greek nation. Metaxas warned of a potential trichotomisi, trisection of Greece, an official Greece enslaved to the Axis powers, a real Greece of public opinion rejecting disgrace, and the third, democratic Greece in the islands under British protection. He declared to the gathered newspaper editors, I have lived in the days of our national schism in 1916, the danger of a new split of Greece, a new schism. I consider this danger for the nation and its future, gentlemen, incomparably worse than war, even if this war may result to the temporary occupation of Greece. Moreover, as Metaxas went on to argue, Greece's natural ally from a geopolitical point of view was Britain, since it commanded the seas. He affirmed, and I quote again, with this policy, the fate of Greece coincides with that of Great Britain, for both of which the sea is not an obstacle, but a bridge. England is a natural friend of Greece. Of course, Metaxas was not naive. He made it clear to the newspaper editors that the struggle would be long, and that Greece might be enslaved for a certain period of time. However, he also made it clear to them that he was confident that the Anglo-Saxon world would eventually prevail in this fight. I quote again, I believe unswervingly that the victory will eventually be on our side, since the Germans will not win. They cannot win. There are many obstacles. We shall finally win. I want you, leaving this room, to take with you my absolute certainty that we will win. Yet he elevated the cause beyond mere triumph. He said, however, I shall repeat that I most solemnly have declared from the very first moment, Greece is not fighting for victory. It is fighting for glory, and it is fighting for honor. Greece has a responsibility towards herself to remain worthy of her past. In that speech, he even correctly predicted that the territorial gain for Greece would be the Dodecanese Islands, then under Italian rule. As he noted, interpreting Churchill's telegram, those who do not see in this telegram, he said, a written confirmation in black and white and a consent for the integration of the Dodecanese Islands with Greece, they cannot read between the lines. Metaxas died at the height of his glory as a respected national leader on January 29, 1941. That was following the defeat of the Italians, but before the German attack of April 1941. Unfortunately, he had not prepared the nation politically for the next days. Let us now return to the moment we're commemorating today for a final time. This story of resistance is not just a Greek story. It is a beacon for the free world. This moment forged a unifying type of nationalism, uniting all Greek people against an existential threat. The Ohi contributed an extra layer on the Greek national identity that is a living fabric that connects the past with the present, reminding us that unity and resistance are a people's strongest weapons. Today, in an era of multiple crises, crisis of legitimacy, of trust, of representation, in an era of international digital bubbles of social media that fragment public opinion and divide us, Ohi reminds us that true patriotism lies in the thoughtful collective action, not division. Thank you. Zito Yelas.
Thank you, Professor. And I remind our audience, if you'd like to submit a question, please use the chat function on your computer, and I will screen the questions and relay them to Professor Mylonas. Well, is what was happening regarding, as with Texas, ultimately, he would have loved to have Greece, be neutral. Was there any negotiations, or for lack of a better word, negotiations, talks going on with Hitler and Germany prior to the Italians invading in any capacity regarding? Can you speak a little bit more to that effect?
Yeah, as he alluded to in his own speech that I talked about, he did have. I mean, he communicated with both Italy and Germany, but it was clear, as I said, from 1936 that he had chosen his course of action for geopolitical reasons. He had a very clear reasoning that I tried to articulate in the very few minutes I had. Um, and the Germans had made it clear that they were intending, as he put it very vividly, to give the left and the right arm of Greece to Bulgaria and Italy, respectively. So entering or remaining neutral wasn't really an option, as he says, because clearly there were really important geopolitical parts of Greece that, the Axis powers wouldn't let unutilized, right? And the same, the British didn't leave unutilized, so they had started operating in Greece once the war had started even more intensely, but even before. So there was a competition, in other words, between the great powers about which side Greece is going to take or which side this Greece is going to go, exactly because of geopolitical positioning, especially vis-a-vis Egypt and the Suez Canal and so on and so forth. So there
Um,
wasn't really a choice, to be honest, as he
I,
said himself. Yeah.
no, I understand, except for Mussolini basically took this unilateral action without Hitler knowing that he was going to do this at the time. Because it seems like, Hitler did not have any intentions, obviously, of moving into Greece until he, went through with his plan, Operation Barbarossa, which ultimately changed his whole plans by having to come in and to, uh, you know, save, his partner in crime, Mussolini. So, uh, again, Hitler really had no idea that Mussolini was about to do this. I just want to be clear
Hitler
on
and
this.
Hitler and Mussolini had a meeting. We don't know exactly what they said, as far as I know. Maybe a historian in the group may know more. I'm a political scientist, but as far as I know, they did have a meeting just before the Italian ultimatum. So in that sense, it's possible that in the meeting, in fact, I would say it's likely that in the meeting, Mussolini told him what he was intending to do. That doesn't mean Hitler agreed. We don't know to what extent there was an agreement. I don't know that, but I would be very suspicious of any theory that says that Hitler had no idea. But maybe there. I don't know if there is any evidence in either direction, to be honest. But it was clear that for the Italian plans to work in Malta, Somaliland, Egypt, they required a control of the sea lanes that Greece controlled, and the British didn't want to give up, right? Yeah.
I don't know if you can
We
speak
have a
to
lot
this
of
or
questions,
not.
though, and maybe many people have stronger views about that than I do on that sequence of things. Yeah.
Look, it always fascinates me that a country as small as Greece, with the limited resources that it had, it took almost 178 days. Some say 211, but let's say somewhere in there. Ultimately to succumb. Where you had other countries like the Netherlands fall in 4 days, France in 43, Belgium in 18, Yugoslavia in 11, and so forth. Uh, what do you attribute this to? I mean, is it just the spirit? Is it the geography of the region? What do you attribute to the fact that Greece ultimately was able to be successful against the Italians, outnumbered in so many different ways? Was it just the Greek spirit, or was it this military strategy? Was it the geography of the region? How do you attribute this?
I mean, obviously, militarily, it has to do with a lot of the things you implied, but I think, in my view, it has to do with the national unity that I try to emphasize, right? Um, so the there is no doubt in my mind that this homothymia, the common cause that is celebrated on October 28th, this common no to Italian aggression, um, is something that I think played a huge role. If you listen to people who lived through that period, and I had the privilege of talking to my grandfather about this many times because he was involved, as I said, he was fighting in the Albanian front. But also some of my uncles who were actually terribly injured in the Battle of Crete. One of them was in bed for his whole life until he died in the late 80s as a result of the wounds he incurred. Um, there is no doubt that they were enthusiastic about entering uh, the ranks of the military at the time, and basically all Greeks came together as one feast, so to speak, as we say in Greek. That is not something that you can easily say about an army that is invading a foreign country and does not necessarily have a very good sense what they're fighting for. So I would put a lot of emphasis on the fact that this was a clearly defensive operation on the part of the Greeks, defending the homeland, which is a concept, the concept of patriotism is a concept that goes all the way back to Homeric times, right? Where Hector comes out and says, to die for the homeland, speaking about Troy at the time, is the best death you can have, basically. It's the ultimate way to die. I think, that was something that was motivating Greek fighters at the time, the Greek society at large, um, which is not something we should underestimate. And I think you alluded to this, Nick, already in the beginning. Similarly, everybody was surprised that Ukraine could last the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion, after February of 2022. And similar explanations have been given. Of course, it has a lot to do with the help they got from outside Western powers. Of course, it has a lot to do with conditions on the ground and like fighting issues. But it cannot be understated. I think it cannot be overstated how important the homothemy, the common, the unison spirit that existed in response to this aggression. So the analogy you drew, I think, is pertinent.
To that point, my follow up to that is, and you kind of allude to it. Uh, I suppose the Greeks fought as homogeneous. There were no British support for Greeks in the actual fighting with the Italians, was there?
There was no actual what?
Support by the British
Well, I mean,
in terms of
it,
manpower or machinery.
the British had been operating in Greece, and that actually, if you read the full ultimatum, the note that was sent by the Italians to the Greeks, they claim, maybe more than was happening, but they claim that basically Greece had turned the keys of the country to Britain, and basically Greece had become almost a big military base of the British. Um, there is no doubt that, as you know, from what I said just a minute ago, Metaxas had decided to align Greece's interests with Britain for obvious geopolitical reasons. Um, there is no doubt that the British had operations. They were actually were operating in Crete, and they were operating in various other parts of Greece. They were trying to um, protect the sea lanes, right? Because they were interested in the Suez Canal and everything that was going on in North Africa. And Metaxas was aware of that. There is no doubt, but that was not obviously. In the Italian mind, that was good enough of a reason to invade. And the idea, the excuse they gave was that we're going to invade. We're not invading to occupy you, they said in the ultimatum. We're invading to take control of geopolitically important areas of your country for military purposes against the British. So obviously that was very odd, and Metaxas could read between the lines, as he says, and that's why he answered alors Sege. So in that sense, there is no doubt that there was British interest. There is no doubt there were British operations. I mean, but at the same time, as you have in your mind, there is no doubt that the Metaxas regime was quite friendly to the ideological background of the Italian and even the German regime at least at earlier times. And those affinities, though, and that I think is another message of the Ohi Day, those affinities were secondary, if not lesser importance, for Ioannis Metaxas, who put his patriotic duty first and his geopolitical analysis as a great military officer he was. We forget that Ioannis Metaxas was chosen by Eleftherios Venizelos as like a really, to head important military positions while he was a prime minister. And, they had their disagreements, but there was absolute respect for each other between themselves. Although, of course, there were also other feelings. They respected the capacities of each individual, and they respected each other. And Metaxas himself has, in his diary, accepted that he's also to blame for the national schism as much as Venizelos in his mind. So in older age, he was willing to accept certain things that maybe perhaps in a younger age he wasn't. Um, so I understand the complaint. I agree with you. It's not a straight. Everything looks so easy to explain after the fact, and it's true. Mussolini did act independently in terms of military action, but it's likely that Hitler found out or knew that he was upset with the Greeks, knew that he was directing his troops. I mean, he definitely knew that he was taking over Albania, basically, Mussolini, right? And it was basically a protectorate of Albania, of Italy for a while, Albania, but that doesn't mean that he approved, right? So that's a nuance that it's hard to capture. And we know that he was angry. There are reports that Hitler was angry. Now, was he angry because he wasn't successful? Or was he angry because he did something he didn't agree with? That's less clear to me, at least. I don't know if we have enough evidence to know what the anger was about. He definitely was angry that he couldn't pull out the victory, right?
And he had
And
to and he had to deploy troops to, when he didn't want
and
to.
divert troops from the Soviet Union campaign. Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that segue, that's a segue into a question I always ask in one of these panels on this particular topic. Obviously, it's been argued by a number of individuals that Greece's heroic actions and the delay of his invasion, Hitler's invasion, Operation Barbarossa, where the winner, caught him and so forth, was a significant turning point in World War II that ultimately provided, to the victory for the Allies. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, there is no doubt that diverting troops costs you time and energy and resources. And in a war as total as World War II, everything counts. So a 2 week delay in Crete, diversion of troops from other fronts to this front, and the occupation, which required a lot of different
28
levels of
divisions.
manpower, exactly, in different
Between
parts.
Yugoslavia and Greece, there were 28 divisions tied down because of the resistance.
So yeah, so I think the correct counterfactual is not just the Battle of Crete or defeating the Italians. I think the counterfactual should start with the geopolitical analysis of Metaxas, and we should put King George in this frame, by the way, because he also agreed with this geopolitical understanding of things at the time, I believe. Um, I don't think Metaxas had a disagreement with the king on that front, although obviously the king was ruling um, um, with support of Metaxas at that point. It's a personalistic dictatorship. So the there is no doubt that this decision to resist and not take the side of the Italians or the Axis powers, let's say, that's where the counterfactual should start, right? That is even neutrality would have benefited the Axis powers. But so there are three things to consider. We didn't ally with the Axis, so we're on the right side of history for the second time in the 20th century. We didn't remain neutral as other countries that I won't mention tried to do and did. And we in fact went to war, defeated one of the biggest powers of that axis at the time, or purportedly big powers. At least Mussolini claimed to be a great power. In practice, it showed that there were many problems in the Italian preparations, obviously, and Hitler knew that. That's why he was angry on top of that. And then we forced the main driving force of the Axis to divert. So it's a multi-stage counterfactual that we need to consider that ends with the Battle of Crete, the heroic Battle of Crete. Not that the rest wasn't heroic. So there are multiple acts of heroism, uh, and the very astute analysis of Metaxas that we need to keep repeating. He did not make this decision on ideological grounds, which he could have. And maybe if he made it only on ideological, narrowly minded ideological grounds, he may have ended up with an unpatriotic, anti Greek position, which he himself explained to everybody. And now we have this proof that he understood and realized. And it's actually bone chilling to realize that this person kind of went against his own ideology that he fought so viscerally to defend because he put his patriotic duty above his ideological predispositions. And that's a message for today, I think.
Well, you didn't want to message, you didn't want to reference one of the countries that was neutral, but I'll mention that country, and of course that was Turkey. However, if you read the book of Albert Speer, Inside the Third Reich, which Albert Speer, of course, was Hitler's architect and war's his armament minister, and he claims in his book that Turkey was providing chromium, which was necessarily to the armaments industry of Germany, and he goes on to say that for the efforts and the supply of chromium by Turkey to Germany, he thinks that the war was extended by at least 6 months. So let's just put it on the table, and that for every death on the battlefield and every death in the concentration camp in that 6 month period, put it on the doorstep of Turkey. So, but that's my pet peeve.
I mean, actually, let's also mention that Turkish neutrality, of course, put Greece in a harder spot. Like it couldn't. There was a. I remind people there was a rapprochement between Greece and Turkey during the Venizelos 1928 onwards years, and the relationship was not super cordial, but it wasn't negative in 1940. But Turkey's neutrality certainly didn't help Greece, right?
Of
Because
course,
it couldn't rely on the support of Turkey for
that's right.
sure, and definitely not Bulgaria at that time. So we shouldn't underestimate. People can hurt you, but also can avoid helping you. That's a different,
Without a
right?
doubt.
So the I think at this point, Greece was actually quite isolated in the neighborhood, which made Metaxas's analysis even more pertinent. The fact that he was so laser focused on how the British are going to play their hand and what was the significance of Greece geopolitically for the British and how they're not going to let go and what implications that had for the unity of the Greek nation down the road. I think we need to commemorate that type of analysis and hope that people that have Greece's foreign policy
At heart.
in their hands today and at their hearts, but also in their hands, think hopefully as astutely and as presently as the Greek people thought and Metaxas thought at the time. Yeah.
We have some questions from our audience, which I'd like to get into now. This comes from James Janos. He asks, during World War II, the Germans forced the National Bank of Greece to loan Germany lots of money. Did Germany ever repay Greece the money that it was forced to lend during World War II? Well, we've heard this now. Certainly, it came up during the current the economic crisis in the past decade regarding this particular loan. Can you speak to this a little bit more?
Well, I mean, this is a big issue, and it has come up, especially during the financial crisis, even more pointedly. And there are whole political parties that are campaigning on this type of issue, right? So the topic was never fully resolved politically or legally. Um, obviously there was, we know there was a debt agreement, the London debt agreement in 1953. Um, but the Greek governments have raised this in various points in time. Um, Officially, Germany has denied that it has, as far as I know, any legal obligation to repay that loan, arguing that this has already been settled by post-war agreements and settled reparations. It's obviously a political issue that various Greek governments and the Minister of Foreign Affairs decides when to raise or not. The salience of that issue, I think, waxes and wanes based on Greek-German relations or what's going on in Brussels, I feel. So I think whatever we say, more than the facts, doesn't help or hurt, to be honest.
We'll
But
keep
it's important to keep on reminding people that this is not, it wasn't settled, at least according to many Greek governments, it wasn't settled.
to the
Uh,
satisfaction of Greece.
yeah, yeah.
We have another question from George Ioannidis. He says, what impact, if any, did Turkey's relations with Greece, as well as the Axis powers, have on the events leading up to October 28th?
Um, so, I mean, we already addressed some of the diplomatic isolation and the lack of support. We could also say, I mean, you can see it in two ways. Greece could not rely on support. It couldn't see Turkey as an ally, obviously. But at the same time, the Axis powers were not going to invade Greece from Turkey's borders. So Greece could concentrate its powers on the Albanian front. So we should be, at least geopolitically, realizing what this, at least theoretical neutrality meant. Obviously, you could not remain neutral if you suddenly had Axis powers coming down your borders into Greece, right? So that's not really neutrality. So there are two ways to see this. Clearly, Turkey was trying to play its hand in a way that it wouldn't relieve the World War One situation in its mind of finding itself in the wrong side of history. Um, so I'm not sure of any other way we could think of this other than what you mentioned and what we mentioned earlier. I think we
Okay.
sort of addressed it before. Yeah.
You may have sort of addressed this as well, but I'll put it out anyway. It's another question. Uh, did any of the great powers influence Greece to resist the Italian ultimatum to surrender, or was it Greece's decision alone? I think you pretty much made it clear that, ultimately Metaxas came to the decision on his own. Would you?
Well, I mean, well, he came, that's why I did it. So it is important to, I think the attempts to put down the importance of Metaxas's decision are wrongheaded. I think this idea of retelling the history in a way that the Greek people said no and not Metaxas, uh, both Metaxas and the Greek people said no, but Metaxas was in the room and he said no, or he didn't say no, he said, then this is war, um, because he knew the king agreed with him, and because he knew that the British, he had already been informed about the intentions of the British that we discussed a little while ago. So, and then in the long discussion with the newspaper editors, he explains his rationale. And I think that's why I, maybe painfully for some of you, went through his quotes, because I think it really shows how agonizing it was for him to reach the right conclusion. And his conclusion was based on three things. One, he really believed that the Axis powers would lose for a variety of reasons, he said. And he was a military officer. He knew what he was talking about, I believe. Second, he believed that if temporarily there is an occupation, ultimately Greece will remain one nation if he sides with the Allies. Third, he knew that if he had gone with the Axis, the British would have taken over the islands, and especially Crete, but also other islands for their own purposes with their navy that they couldn't, the Greek powers couldn't resist. And at the same time, he knew that because he had been told by the Germans that Bulgaria and Italy had laid claims over different parts of the existing Greek territory. Obviously, Bulgaria had the constant, desire to go into the warm seas in the Aegean, and Italy had made clear claims on various parts of Western Greece. So, and there were multiple folders, by the way, when I was doing my work on the interwar period. In the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you can find folders over folders on Romanian or Italian propaganda in the area, right? So it's not that the Italians were not working on this even before the war. There were attempts to, cultivate fifth columns, as I call them in my Enemies Within book, and uh, to basically agitate and create internal problems for Greece in certain areas, right? So this is all in line with the politics of nation building that I discuss in other works. I just don't want to get too theoretical here. Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. Well, look, I want to get to something that is one of those other pet peeves of mine. You mentioned, the context of Greece's heroic stance along the lines of beacon is a beacon for the free world in terms of the actions that it perpetrated in 1940 of October 28th, given the circumstances that it was facing. Yet, Professor, this hardly gets any mention at all in any, at least in the United States, in any history books on World War II that I've ever read on. You just don't see anything where October 28, 1940, and the Greek resistance and the defeat of Albanians, which, if you notwithstand the minor battle at Norwich, Norway, in May of 1940 between the Brits, where the Brits, the Poles, and the French fought in Norway, and is somewhat attributed as the first victory against the Axis. This really was the first major victory against the Axis, but the story is not told anywhere. And let me emphasize by making one other point, which I've made on this broadcast before. When I visited Normandy, which I wanted to pay my respects to for all those who fell for us to be free here today. It was 2009, and me and my daughter were on a tour to go into Norway, and the tour guide in France came on and started talking about World War II vignettes. And she mentioned as the first victories of the Allies of World War II were Al Alamein and Midway, both of them which took place respectively October 1942 and June of 1942, well after what Greece did from 1940 to 1941. When I went and corrected her, or brought it to her attention afterwards, she acknowledged that I was correct in terms of, Greece and its actions, but certainly did not come back on the bus, okay, and to correct it to the 50 English-speaking tourists who were on their way to Norway. My point being, this is just a story that for whatever reason, it's just not well known, okay, in today's Western world or really anywhere in the world in terms of the heroic actions, okay, of what Greece did, not just within the context of October 28th, 1940, but its resistance until ultimate defeat on June 1, 1941, almost 200 days after, more so than any other major country in Central Western Europe. And yet, this is a story, no movie. Dunkirk, there's been at least 3 movies, which was an ultimate failure on behalf of, the Brits. There's been all sorts of movies on that. God knows how many movies have been made on World War II. It might be even in the hundreds, if not maybe thousands. And yet, nothing ever has ever been discussed on this issue. How can we change this narrative? And why the narrative doesn't exist, other than those of us in the Greek-speaking world?
So you're right. I mean, if somebody checks the bibliography, um, it's true that the histories that mention it are either written by Greek Americans or Greek origin people who obviously pay attention to what happened, or it's mentioned to non-Greek authored books, but on the Balkans. So more specifically focused histories of the Balkans. So you're right. This narrative, this message, this um, moment, which is, and it's not just a moment, as you said, but it symbolizes the whole period, um, is not highlighted in any mainstream works, as far as I know, as well. And maybe, we can stand corrected if somebody produces that. But I agree with you that it's a fact that I haven't seen it being prominently featured. The resistance is more has made its way into the mainstream historiography, the Greek resistance, exactly because it was such a strong partisan movement that is more often mentioned. But the Ohi and the defeat of the Italians hasn't received the level of attention that it should have. And I would say even until lately, I don't think many people, even in Greece, had actually appreciated the reasoning behind Metaxas's
Decision.
rationale
Yeah.
and logic. I know Professor Mavrodatos has written articles on this. There are a few other, intellectuals who have pointed to this. It was known. It was published in the diary of Metaxas, but it wasn't made a big deal. In fact, um, it was mostly, and that's where it was mostly celebrated as internally as something that was heroic, and it was um, more folkloric rather than historical, right? At least in the way it was presented to the students, and that has to do with how history education also is in Greece. We stop early. We try to we try not to enter discussions that are very problematic, like the Civil War, right? So there are reasons why, and Metaxas was a dictator. So there are all these sensitivities that preclude a serious discussion. But you're right. Now, going to your call for action, like how can this be undone? I hope some of the people listening may have connections in Hollywood, or it doesn't have to be a fiction film. It could be a documentary, like but made for mainstream audiences. It could be a PBS documentary. It could be something like that. I understand there are many Hellenic American organizations that have tried to raise the visibility. There are several attempts, and if somebody Googles Ohi Day, they can find several initiatives. But I agree with you that this still remains within the confines of the community. It has a really hard time penetrating, the broader, broader society, and entering the homes of Italian Americans, or well, actually, that wouldn't be the best first group, but or all sorts of Jewish Americans, or other, and I mentioned Mordechai Frizis, and there were a lot more Greek Jews who fought in that war, and many of them died fighting as Greeks and for Greece. So that story is also a story that has to be retold, and it goes back to my point that this was a moment of unity. Left-wing people and right-wing people were fighting together, rich and poor, Christians and Jews. Everybody who felt Greek patriotism put everything aside, including Metaxas, put his ideology aside and put country first. And that for the defense of the country, because nationalism can also be used for imperialistic purposes. But this is a glorious moment because you can celebrate this unifying, defensive, patriotic type of nationalism that superseded a lot of cleavages in society at the time. And that's something we desperately need today, not a war, but we need the unison, that spirit, both in Greece and beyond.
Well,
Um,
speaking of the demographics, which you kind of allude to, now we know that the Soviet Union lost the most in terms of people, it was 20 million approximately that were killed in World War II. By percentage, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Greeks, by percentage, based on their population, was one of the highest, if not the highest percentage, which was at least what, a million that were killed approximately,
It
over
was
10% of the
devastating.
population.
It was devastating, and unfortunately, there are many deaths that were related to the occupation, but they were also linked to the beginnings of the Greek Civil War also that happened during the occupation between people who are resisting and people who are collaborating and so on and so forth. So it's hard to draw the line sometimes because a lot of this is in the context of resistance, but there are resistant groups who are fighting between each other for control in certain areas. So that's why it's hard to get to an actual estimate that is only from the occupation, or how do we count those dead from the early 1943 onwards period of the Civil War? But you're absolutely right. The estimates are really high and they don't include blood related deaths. Unfortunately, mostly they include civilians. Uh,
Famine. I mean, famine was a major issue.
and of course, especially in my hometown, Thessaloniki, the vast majority of the Jews of my
Yeah,
hometown were died.
90%, I believe.
Yeah, yeah.
One last question here. It's a little maybe off the beaten path a little bit, but something that I have spoken on in terms of the readings and research that I've done, and if you can corroborate this, uh, I've also argued by virtue, like I said, of what I've read, that what the Greeks did on October 28th, 1940, also in many ways helped to propel the Greek American community into the mainstream of American society. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we all know, of course, of a HEPA, started in 22 because, it was just, the Ku Klux Klan wasn't just against blacks, but they were against Greeks. There were, there were certainly bias, racism regarding the Greeks as well. But there are stories, ever since, Greece defeated Mussolini, the New York Times the next day banner headlines talking about the heroism of the Greeks and so forth. And that ultimately propelled the Greek American community much faster, okay, in being accepted here as an ethnic group. Have you read anything to this effect, or you can corroborate this? Because I have, and I use
Totally.
it.
There's no doubt that but it happened in multiple ways. First, there is no doubt that the self-esteem of the Greek diaspora in the United States um, was greatly affected by the success, especially that was reported multiple times in the New York Times and other, news media of the time. Um, and the politicians ranging from Churchill and Roosevelt that spoke highly of the heroism of Greeks in multiple ways and multiple times, but also that boosted the pride, obviously. Now, once you get this sense of pride, which maybe you didn't have earlier, right? That makes you more likely to want to hang out with more people of your kind, right? Because you want to talk about this and commemorate it and discuss it further, and because that gives you a good feeling, and that good feeling was a result of this moment and of this the heroism of the people who fought there. Now, at the same time, um, this also happened at the mainstream at the time. Mainstream media, Life magazine famously had that cover.
The
That
F zone blowing the trumpet.
Yeah, yeah, and how often does that happen for any people, right? I mean, go and look at Life magazine covers or Economist covers. How often do countries get portrayed positively, unequivocally positively by any news association, to be honest? The Ukrainians are a good example. I think that happened with Ukraine, and rightly so, with the resistance. But again, it's not very common. And I remind you, there are many peoples in the world. It's not that there is little competition in terms of like who's going to be on the cover. So, so that was a was happening on both fronts, both self-esteem and pride, a desire to be more identified with your community, more cultural clubs get created, as you implied, and flourish. But at the same time, the mainstream of society is accepting you more and your identity as fundamental. Now, of course, in the elite circles, being Greek was seen as a positive thing already, because these people were educated and they knew of Plato and Aristotle. And when you told them you're Greek, they saw someone who has access to that literature and can read the original, perhaps, right? So, when a Greek leader would come and meet with elites, they wouldn't feel the same thing that someone who was a busboy or worked in a kitchen would feel, right? So there was this classist or, type of divergence. But suddenly this trickles down to popular media, right? And it becomes something that becomes an assumption, a positive assumption about associating Greeks with courage or heroism among people who had not read Plato necessarily, didn't know much about Greek
The
mythology.
overwhelming majority, I would say, of the grassroots American mainstream community.
So you're absolutely right that at that level it becomes popularized, and there is I guess a leveling of the elites and the masses, or so to speak, or the popular opinion vis-a-vis the Greek people, and it helps get Greeks out of that categorization of like non-white, perhaps, right? Because I don't know to what extent Greeks were perceived as white in a racially very charged period of time for American politics at the time, right? There is a famous book about the Irish people who were also not treated as being mainstream of society. And that title of the book that made me talk about what I just told you was called "When the Irish Became White," which is a book by an anthropologist kind of explaining how Irish changed status in society and how that process happened. And you could say similarly, it's a story of social mobility of Greeks in the United States, I think, and it definitely contributes to removing a ceiling for the Greek people that may have been there, perhaps invisible to them, but may have been there before.
I still find it interesting, though, how so many who migrated from Greece to come to these shores from the early 20th century on, for what the country was not able to provide for it within its own shores, during this action, it gave them a helping hand 5,000 miles away and boosted them ultimately in terms of, hey, Greece is still here. And we're strong, we're heroic, we're honorable. And by doing so, it gave, its immigrant community in the United States what it needed to ultimately propel itself into the mainstream. We would have gotten there. There's no doubt about it. We would have gotten to where we are today.
But it was
But we
definitely
got
an
there. But we got
accelerator.
there faster. We got
It
there a
was an
lot
accelerator.
faster.
Yeah, it was an
Anyway,
accelerator.
we're gonna wrap it up here, but just a couple of closing comments. Uh, Here at the American Hellenic Institute, we try to do whatever we can regarding bringing awareness to the heroic efforts of Greece during not just in October 28th, but throughout its whole resistance, including the Battle of Crete and overall what it did as a small nation during the whole war period regarding resisting the Axis war machine. Uh, and something that maybe you may not be aware of, Professor, I'm not going to mention the person's name. Many years ago, I brought up to somebody in Hollywood, a Greek, and I said, why can't we make a movie about this heroic effort of Oshide? We create, a love story or something, but build it around the facts, okay, and have that be an epic movie. And I was just exasperated by the response. The response was, "Oh, you want us to make a propaganda movie?" So we are still our worst enemy in so many ways, unfortunately. I'll never forget that, and I use that example again. I'm not going to betray the person's name, but that was a response I got. Nonetheless, though, here's a book. It's out of print, unfortunately, but over 20 years ago, we put this major two-day conference in Washington called Greece's Pivotal Role in World War II and its importance to the U.S. today. It is out of print, but we made a major effort, okay, to try to bring awareness regarding Greece's heroic role in World War II. And I will end with a caption from the back cover of that book. And I'll give you the name of who said it at the end. And I quote, "As the years pass, it becomes more and more necessary to recall and record for new generations just how the people of Greece, alone or with allies, gained and held for their country for a century and more the independence and democracy it possesses today, and how in one special moment in history, Greece, at a heavy cost and sacrifice, and with great courage and determination, played a pivotal role in World War II and defying the forces of tyranny and Axis aggression that were arrayed against not only Greece, but the whole of Western civilization. It is an inspiring story," end quote. And it was said by General Andrew J. Goodpaster, United States Army retired, former Supreme Commander of NATO. So we will finish on that. I want to thank Professor Mylonas for taking the time to be here today and to help commemorate the 85th anniversary of the heroic efforts of the Greek nation and fight against Axis and authoritarianism in World War II. I want to thank our audience who tuned in today. I want to thank our newest staff member, Melina, who sort of acted as a producer for today's program. I want to thank her very much. And I also want to thank our sponsor, who is always in support of all our efforts, and including these Zoom presentations that we do, and that's Jim Lagos from Springfield, Ohio. Everyone, well, we wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in today, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future Zoom. Zito, as we would say. Thank you again, Professor.
Thank you. Ευχαριστώ.
That's it.